You know, when we think about big wars, we often picture armies clashing directly, but there's this whole other layer underneath, right? This world of arms deals happening in the shadows.
Absolutely. And it can be completely decisive sometimes.
Exactly. And right now, there's a really significant flow of weapons shaking things up in the Ukraine war. And maybe surprisingly, Iran's become a major supplier to Russia. We're talking drones, maybe even missiles.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it really shows how countries facing similar international pressures can kind of band together, find these workarounds, even if their deeper goals aren't perfectly aligned.
Totally. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a bit, news reports from places like Yahoo News, AOL, and also some really insightful original analysis that connects the dots on the public info. Our goal today really is to unpack this whole Iran-Russia arms pipeline, like what exactly is being sent, why are they both doing this, and, what could this mean down the line for the war, for global politics. Let's get into it, starting with the hardware. What weapons are we actually seeing change hands here?
Well, the main thing, what's pretty much confirmed, is the drones, the UAVs, especially the Shahed 136. People call it a kamikaze drone.
Right.
It's essentially a low-cost, long-range weapon. It kind of hangs around, loiters, waiting for a target, and then boom.
So not for spying, just for hitting things.
Pretty much. Think of them like slow, cheap cruise missiles. Russia's been using them in waves, often targeting infrastructure, power grids, that kind of thing, deep inside Ukraine.
And they've made a real impact, haven't they? The reports really stress the danger to ordinary people. I mean, that terrible Palm Sunday attack in Sumy, so many killed. It's just awful. A brutal reminder of the human cost.
It really is. And it's not just the Shahed 136. We're also seeing the Mohajer 6.
Okay, what's that one?
That's more of a traditional drone, initially for reconnaissance surveillance. But reports suggest they've been armed up too. They might carry their own missiles or help guide other weapons.
So a bit more versatile.
Yeah. And then there's the less certain stuff. Intelligence chatter about potential ballistic missile transfers. Specifically, the Fate 110 and Zulfiqar models.
Ballistic missiles. Wow, okay. That's a big step up.
Huge step. These are short-range ballistic missiles, much faster than drones, bigger punch, harder to intercept. If those are truly being supplied, it's a serious escalation in the kind of firepower Russia's getting from Iran.
So this is where it gets really interesting for me. How did this whole deal even start? I mean, Russia and Iran, they haven't exactly been best military buddies historically, have they?
No, not really in this way. The thinking is, as the war dragged on in early 2022, and Russia started, burning through its own stockpiles and facing setbacks.
And the Western sanctions started biting?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's when talks with Iran seemed to have really picked up speed. There were reports about Russian officials actually flying to Iran, specifically looking at these drone systems.
And they were trying to keep it quiet, right? The analysis we looked at mentioned secret flights using routes across the Caspian Sea, trying to stay off the radar.
Yeah, very hush-hush. Which tells you how sensitive it is, how much they wanted to avoid international backlash if it was easily provable.
Which brings us to the why. Why would Russia, with its own massive arms industry, need to go shopping in Iran for drones?
Well, like you said, the sanctions are a big part of it. Cutting off access to Western tech components, that hurts. And secondly, frankly, Iranian drones are cheaper. Russia chewed through a lot of its own high-end missiles early on. These drones offer a more, let's say, cost-effective way to keep up the pressure. It looks like strategic necessity, really, driven by losses and money.
Battlefield needs and empty pockets, basically.
Something like that. Now, flip the coin. What's in it for Iran? Why are they getting so involved with Russia on this?
Money seems like the obvious first answer. These deals must be bringing in some serious cash for Tehran. Millions, maybe hundreds of millions.
Sure, revenue is definitely part of it for an economy under sanctions itself.
But the analysis also brought up something else, the idea that Iran gets valuable feedback. Like Russia uses these drones in a real high-intensity war, finds out what works, what doesn't.
And feeds that info back to Iran, potentially leading to upgrades, maybe even getting some Russian tech in return.
Exactly. It could be a two-way street. Iran gets cash and battlefield R&D, essentially. Improving their own military tech based on real-world use.
That's a really key point. It's not just about selling weapons. It's about learning, improving, making their own systems more potent down the line.
Okay, so if this is happening, the rest of the world must be reacting, right?
Oh, yeah. Predictably, the West has condemned it. Lots of sanctions talk. The U.S. and the EU have rolled out new sanctions specifically hitting Iranian drone makers, companies helping with the transfers. And Ukraine naturally is pushing hard for even tougher measures, trying to choke off these supply lines.
Makes sense. But one of the articles we looked at pointed out something potentially significant about U.S. sanctions announced back on April 1st. They hit companies in Iran, the UAE, even China. But apparently they didn't specifically name Russia in that round regarding these particular arms sales.
That is interesting. And it kind of leads into a major point from one of our sources, doesn't it, about the current U.S. administration's approach.
Right. That article really focused on what it described as a lack of strong direct action, specifically targeting Russia over these Iranian weapons.
It even contrasts it with the previous administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which, okay, it wasn't about this specific Russia deal, but it did broadly go after Iran's money.
Yeah, the implication being that the focus has shifted or maybe lessened on this particular issue. So the key thing for you listening isn't just that this trade is happening, but how complex the international response can be.
It's almost like a playbook, isn't it? How countries under sanctions can find these creative, maybe destabilizing ways around the rules.
Totally. And the article mentioned former President Trump included a quote where he acknowledges Iran's drones are objective, but didn't really address stopping the sales to Russia. It also said reporters couldn't get answers from his White House, Treasury, or State Department about it. Then there's the UN voting record mentioned in one piece.
Ah, yes. The U.S. voting against resolutions naming Russia as the aggressor or calling for withdrawal.
Which, definitely sends a mixed message, doesn't it?
Certainly raises eyebrows. And you had former officials quoted, like John Bolton, saying, according to the source, that the U.S. had effectively switched sides. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. And then add in comments attributed to Trump suggesting Ukraine had some blame for the war, or his advisor proposing Russia might get to keep parts of Ukraine. It builds a certain narrative, right or wrong, about a shift in the U.S. position.
And the takeaway for you is just how messy and sometimes contradictory these international stances can be. Stated policies don't always line up perfectly with actions on the ground, and that creates space for deals like this Iran-Russia one.
It was quite striking to read quotes from people like Ned Price or Olivia Troy, who worked in past administrations, voicing worries about the U.S. potentially, siding with dictators or abandoning Ukraine.
Yeah, strong language.
And Stephen Pfeiffer's point was interesting, too, basically saying the current administration doesn't seem to be making this Iran to Russia arms flow a top priority issue with Moscow.
He suggested the U.S. has leverage. It's not using, like tougher sanctions, using those seized Russian assets.
Exactly. Saying there seems to be an unwillingness to pressure Putin in any meaningful way on this specific front. So, okay. Looking forward, what might happen next with all this?
Well, a few possibilities seem likely. One, Iran could sell even more stuff to Russia. Maybe more advanced drones, maybe those ballistic missiles actually show up in larger numbers.
Okay.
On the flip side, Ukraine and its partners will definitely try harder to counter it. Better jamming tech against the drones, maybe even riskier moves like trying to hit the supply lines themselves.
That could get complicated fast.
Very. And then there's the longer game. This could become a deeper military partnership, maybe even joint weapons production inside Russia.
So not just a quick fix for Russia, but maybe the start of a more lasting military alignment.
Could be. And if you zoom out, this whole situation really highlights how modern warfare increasingly relies on these asymmetric tools, drones, and these shadowy supply networks.
Black markets, basically.
Yeah. And this growing Russia-Iran link. Both countries facing sanctions, both challenging the West. It could really reshape conflicts way beyond Ukraine. Think about the Middle East, Syria, Yemen.
And could it encourage other countries under sanctions, like North Korea, to do similar deals?
That's definitely a concern. It sets a potential precedent.
Okay, so let's try to sum up this deep dive. Key takeaway. Iran is definitely a major arms supplier to Russia now, mostly drones, possibly missiles, and it's having a real effect in Ukraine.
Right. And the reasons are complex. Russia needs weapons. It can afford under sanctions. Iran wants the money and maybe the tech know-how.
And the international response, especially from the U.S., is, well, it's debated. Critics point to a lack of decisive action, specifically on this arms trade, based on the sources we looked at.
And it really shows how a regional war like Ukraine gets tangled up in these bigger global power shifts, creating these new alliances, these new axes of cooperation.
Absolutely. Hopefully breaking this down has given you a clearer picture of this really critical, but maybe under the radar part of the war and what it could mean globally. Getting past the headlines.
Yeah, trying to understand the mechanics behind it all.
Yeah, trying to understand the mechanics behind it all.
Which leaves us with maybe one final thought to chew on. This growing cooperation, this axis between nations facing sanctions, nations wanting to challenge the current world order. What are the real long-term dangers? What does this mean for global security, for diplomacy down the road?
That's the big question, isn't it? No easy answers, but definitely something we all need to keep watching very closely.